just post some stuff here before we get started. Just let me know if the lighting is too dark. What happened was the light bulb to this other lamp that I use on my left side here died on me. And it's an older lamp. So I don't think I can actually replace the light bulb on it. Yeah, if you really want to see it, I'll show you later. But it's like an older lamp and the light bulb died, so it lasted me a while, so. But anyway, that's why it's kind of darker. If it's too dark, I may turn on some lights or something. Or I may have to take a break on the stream and grab like other lights or whatever. But before we start, I'm just going to finish posting stuff on my social media pages to let you guys know that we are starting up today. Hi Virgil, welcome to the stream. Let me just finish here. Apparently I can't spell Samuel. There you go. I don't understand what sort of live is it? I guess you're new to these kinds of streams that I do, Virgil. This is one of the main things I actually do on my channel, really, which is Bible readings and Bible teaching. And that's kind of, I mean, it goes with the name, right? The streaming Parson, right? And so I do I basically, read through parts of the Bible and kind of clear up a lot of misconceptions and hopefully give a better teaching than a lot of people receive. Not that, I mean, you can't say this without sounding a little bit mean, but one of my big critiques of modern evangelicalism is that modern evangelicals suck at teaching the Bible, right? They're terrible at it. I did my whole thesis on it, actually, in regards to the book of Genesis. Shameless plug-in, go check out my Genesis read-through, where I talk a lot more about that because I did my thesis on, modern evangelicals suck at teaching the Bible, and Genesis is a clear case in point where Genesis is about prophecy as opposed to a lot of the more historical stuff people like to get caught up in debates about. And so the way that I went through the Genesis reading was like, look at everything from a like how the Bible treats prophecy. And so that was kind of something that I find to be very important, that we teach the Bible a lot better. So that's kind of why I do this. And so anyway, with that being said, okay, I put up all this other stuff on social media. Looks like we're ready. All right. Just let me know if the lighting is bad. I think it is a little bad. OBS is not indicative of what you actually see. So I'm going to turn up the lighting a little bit. If it's too bright, just let me know. I think when I look at it on OBS here, it's a little darker than what actually shows up. So I may think it's like okay, but it might not be. It might be like way too bright or way too dark or something. Just let me know. Anyway, with that said, let's begin. Hello and welcome to the Streaming Parson Reads the Book of Samuel. Yes, we finished the Book of Judges last week, and we moved to the Book of Samuel. And I'm gonna skip the Book of Ruth. Not because I hate it or anything, actually I really like the Book of Ruth, but I kind of feel like I want to keep the trend that was, the Book of Judges really set up. And you continue, the important themes as you're reading through the Bible. You can keep up with certain important themes. If you go straight from Judges to the Book of Samuel. Of course, I'll just kind of give like a TLDR of the Book of Ruth. But before that, we're going to start with a quick word of prayer. We'll start from Samuel 1, of course, but I'll kind of have a lot of lecture stuff at the beginning, because I also want to be a lot more clear on how we're going to approach the book of Samuel. And so, but you can flip to 1 Samuel 1. That's where we're going to start today. If you have a, Bible Gateway, Bible app, if you got a Bible with you, that's great. I like to just hold a paper copy, even though, like, I have a whole bunch of notes here on my computer. And, like, if I could actually show you, I would, but I have, like, all this note stuff because I like to be really nerdy and academic like that. You can take the student out of this. You can take the student out of the school, but sometimes you can't take the school out of the student. Not exactly something to brag about, I guess. But anyway, I'll give you guys a minute to flip over to 1 Samuel. But as you do that, I'm just going to start us off with a quick word of prayer. Let's pray. Heavenly Father, we thank you for this day, and we thank you for this time that we have to read your word. And I just pray that as we read your word, you would reveal to us, your desire for our lives and your calling for our lives, and what where you want to lead us, and lead us closer to you. Ultimately, I just pray this in the name of your Son, Jesus. Amen. Okay, so we got like a massive preface because the book of Samuel is, I got a lot of things to say before I actually start reading, the Bible to you. So the first thing, I'm going to just clear this up. I say the book of Samuel, and I'm going to, when I say the book of Samuel, I treat 1st and 2nd Samuel as one book. And in a way, they really are. They're actually really one book. Of course, the shift in tone between 1st and 2nd Samuel is the reason why I think most Bible translators, and, not just the Bible translators, but when the priestly tradition during, the post-exilic period, and they were, putting all the manuscripts together, and also kind of dividing how the Bible was to be read. And of course, they do like scripture readings in the synagogue, whatever. Somewhere, someone decided to split up the book of Samuel into 1st and 2nd Samuel. And there's a completely logical reason why they would do that. Because there is a kind of a shift in tone between 1st and 2nd Samuel. But when I talk about the book of Samuel, I will refer to them as one book. And you will catch me doing this a lot. I will refer to 1st and 2nd Samuel as the book of Samuel. It's one book. Another thing, too, that I just want to just kind of start this off, and something I want to avoid doing, even though, yes, the pastoral way of doing things, we have the advantage of Jesus Christ to clear up everything that is more ambiguous in the book of Samuel. But something I want to do with these readings is to view the book from the perspective of Nathan. Now, you're wondering, who the hell is Nathan, right? For those of you who don't know your Bibles as well as you should, Nathan is arguably the writer of the book of Samuel. Now, Nathan is an interesting character. He also shows up in the book of Samuel. So yes, he self-inserts himself later in the story, in the parts that he's in. Now, who the heck is Nathan, right? So Nathan, the prophet Nathan, because there's another Nathan, but not that one. The prophet Nathan would be the last member of the order of the judges, right? So we read through the book of Judges, and there were various leaders that God would send out to kind of take care of Israel and be like pseudo shepherds, if you will, or temporary shepherds, right? Regent shepherds would be a better way of looking at it. And so this tradition of judges lasted for for a while, not a long time, only a couple hundred years. Because later the age of Judges ends, with the beginning of the age of kings, right? And of course, you notice this when you read like the Book of Kings, for a good example. The judges are no longer anywhere to be found. Nathan is arguably the last one. And what makes him so important is that Nathan, being the writer of the Book of Samuel, upholds a certain revelation that is tends to be forgotten about when we read the Book of Samuel. Now, I don't want to fault any Christians that wonder why, we have certain forgotten elements of the Book of Samuel's revelation. It's, once again, it's not so much because, how do I put this? Because we have the New Testament, certain things in the Old Testament tend to get lost in translation, and they tend to be no longer thought about. We don't think about certain parts of the Old Testament anymore because we have the New Testament. And, there's legitimacy to that, right? Because there's certain things that aren't relevant anymore. But something I want to point out, and this is going to be my hot take of the entire series, if you will. I think reading the Book of Samuel is really important in the 21st century, especially with a lot of political and other, sociological mishaps and, problems that we're having, in the world, and especially in the West. I think the Book of Samuel it should really speak to us. And there's a forgotten revelation that is in the Book of Samuel. Well, it's not a forgotten one. I mean, it's not like the Bible ever put this under the rug. But something that bothers me is that you don't hear people talk about this part of the Book of Samuel as much, right? Because a lot of people get more caught up in the whole messianic parts of the Book of Samuel. And I'm not saying those parts aren't important, right? Obviously, Jesus coming and fulfilling all the messianic prophecies obviously is important, right? I mean, that's the foundation of the faith. But how I want to treat our reading of the Book of Samuel is to get a more thorough understanding of how, regardless of, where we are, what time we live in, things like who we are as people, right? Like your race, gender, whatever, all those things. Regardless of those things, there's a certain thing we should have always kept in mind, a certain revelation that God had given to Samuel, and hence why the book is called the Book of Samuel. Now, of course, with that being said, what makes Nathan such a badass, in my mind, and you'll hear me sing this guy's praises. I think he's a great character, even though he doesn't appear that much. But being the writer of the Book of Samuel, at least most Bible scholars assume this to be true. Samuel upholds this. He keeps that revelation that God gave to Samuel as the centerpiece of the Book of Samuel. And I will, I'll try not to give it away immediately, because I mean the Bible does it for you anyway. So, pay attention, take notes if you have to, and I don't mind backtracking a bit for clarity and clarifications, but I want us to pay attention to this revelation and what it is and how important it is even for us in 2021 to pay attention to. And this revelation that God gives to Samuel, and it being the main theme, the real main theme, right? And so I'm not going to exactly give away what that is. Hopefully, the Spirit will reveal that to you. I mean, the words of Scripture will reveal it to you, right? At least it should, if I'm doing this right. But with that being said, that's kind of the direction I want to take this reading of Samuel, right? I don't want to go too much into more modern preaching style, because I want us to think about critically what Nathan was trying to accomplish when the Book of Samuel was written, and how we applied that on, one, a secular level of how we live in our daily lives, and two, how we ground ourselves in our faith lives and our relationship with Jesus. And so the second part I'll definitely talk about more later. as we come toward the end of the book of Samuel. But the other things will kind of come up a lot more often than you think. And I want you guys to pay attention to that as we analyze, this revelation that God gives to Samuel. And I think it's pretty profound when we think about it more deeply, and that we should be thinking about it more, especially in the 21st century. So with that being said, well, I guess I should cover some basic facts about like when the book of Samuel was probably written. So once again, since we're dealing with all this stuff before like the book of Ezra, so more likely the book of Samuel had some editions, as the book of Ezra implies that parts of the Bible are edited by the priestly order in Ezra. So yes, the Bible acknowledges that it's edited. Okay, so people gotta stop being like, oh no, it was unchanged when like Nathan wrote it in roughly 900 BC, probably a little bit before that. So let's just say like 10th century BC, something like that. So the story kicks off with 1 Samuel, and funnily enough, it starts long before the revelation shows up, but we gotta have an origin story. So let's begin with 1 Samuel chapter 1. So there was a certain man from Ramathaim, a Zuphite, from the hill country of Ephraim, whose name was Elkanah, son of Jeroham, the son of Elihu, the son of Tohu, the son of Zuph, an Ephraimite. Now this guy had 2 wives. One was called Hannah, and the other Penina. I think that's how you say that. Penina had children, but Hannah had none. Now year after year this man went up from his town to worship and sacrifice to the Lord at Shiloh, where Hophni and Phinehas, the 2 sons of Eli, were priests of the Lord. Now whenever the day came for Elkanah to sacrifice, he would give portions of the meat to his wife Penina and to all her sons and daughters. But to Hannah he gave a double portion because he loved her. And the Lord had closed her womb. Now because the Lord had closed Hannah's womb, her rival kept provoking her in order to irritate her. Now this went on year after year. Whenever Hannah went up to the house of the Lord, her rival provoked her till she wept and would not eat. Her husband Elkanah would say to her, Hannah, why are you weeping? Why don't you eat? Why are you downhearted? Don't I mean more to you than 10 sons? Once they had finished eating and drinking in Shiloh, Hannah stood up. Now Eli the priest was sitting on his chair by the doorpost of the Lord's house. In her deep anguish, Hannah prayed to the Lord, weeping bitterly. And she made a vow, saying, O Lord Almighty, if you would only look on your servant's misery and remember me, and not forget your servant, but give her a son, then I will give him to the Lord for all the days of his life, and no razor will ever be used on his head. As she kept praying to the Lord, Eli observed her mouth. Now Hannah was praying in her heart, but her lips were moving, but her voice was not heard. So Eli thought she was drunk, and said to her, How long are you going to stay drunk? Put away your wine. Not so, my lord, Hannah replied. I am a woman who is deeply troubled. I have not been drinking wine or beer. I was pouring out my soul to the Lord. Do not take your servant for a wicked woman. I have been praying here out of my great anguish and grief. Eli answered, Go in peace, and may the God of Israel grant you what you have asked of him. Hannah said, May your servant find favor in your eyes. And she went away and ate something, and her face was no longer downcast. Now early the next morning they arose and worshipped before the Lord, and then went back to their home in Ramah. Elkanah made love to his wife Hannah, and the Lord remembered her. So in the course of time, Hannah became pregnant and gave birth to a son. She named him Samuel, saying, Because I asked the Lord for him. Verse 21. So when her husband Elkanah went up with his family to offer the annual sacrifice, as to fulfill his vows, Hannah did not go. Excuse me. She said to her husband, After the boy is weaned, I will take him and present him to the Lord, and he will live there always. Do what seems best to you, her husband Elkanah told her. Stay here until you have weaned him. Only may the Lord make good his word. So the woman stayed at home and nursed her son until she had weaned him. After he was weaned, she took the boy with her, young as he was, along with a 3-year-old bull, an ephah of flour, and a skin of wine, and brought him to the house of the Lord at Shiloh. When the bull had been sacrificed, they brought the boy to Eli. And she said to him, Pardon me, my lord. As surely as you live, I am the woman who stood here beside you praying to the Lord. I prayed for this child, and the Lord has granted me what I asked him. So now I give him to the Lord, for his whole life will be given over to the Lord. And he worshipped the Lord there. Woman voices. Always a challenge. Anyway, so chapter 1, right? The birth of Samuel, right? And so, in a way, like, even though Samuel will kind of fade away from being the main character in a lot of ways, of course, the book is named after him, and of course, as I've already said earlier, the real theme of the book of Samuel is found in the Revelations. Well, it's really one revelation, but God says it multiple times, so we'll say revelations. But the revelations that God gives to Samuel. And so, of course, the book of Samuel starts with Samuel's birth, right? Samuel's kind of special, right? He's born to a woman that's probably had, like, pregnancy problems. And, of course, the Bible, well, because, you know, we're talking, like, I mean, what is this, like 10th century BC, right? They don't have our modern scientific knowledge, so things like she may have had fertility problems or something like that, but no one really knew how to deal with that. I mean, how, like, what medicine was there at the time, right? So, like, the reason why I bring this up is because I want to get around this the euphemism that the Bible uses when it talks about, like, the Lord had closed her womb or whatever, right? And some people may misinterpret this and think, like, well, God's being pretty malicious or something, right? And so, well, I want to move away from that because, once again, you're supposed to view Samuel's birth as like a miracle, right? It's a miracle that God. Let's put it this way: instead of viewing the passage where it says that, oh well, God had her womb closed, as opposed to viewing that as like God being kind of nefarious and not allowing a woman to get pregnant, but rather you understand that verse as a euphemism of the woman had, like, whatever kind of birthing, pregnancy problems, right? Because, you know, women have, some women just have those, medical problems. It's kind of just the way it is. Even in the modern day, right? But I mean, in the modern day, some of that can get circumvented around, right? Because the beauties of modern science, thank God for modern science, right? But back then, that didn't exist. So, some women were totally screwed over if that were to happen, right? And we see this in the kind of conflict, if you want to call it that, between Hannah and Penina, where Penina would just be like a catty bitch to her, right? And be like, haha, you have no kids, right? God doesn't love you. because you can't have kids, right? Sometimes people are just born with deficiencies, right? But of course, how you should read it is that it's a miracle that Samuel is born, right? He's kind of like a miracle child, and of course we've read this in other parts of the Bible, right? The prime example is Sarah with Isaac, right? And I mean, Sarah was like super old by the time she had him. And of course, the other popular one that's mentioned is Rachel, right? And so these women they had like some kind of biological problem that's not identifiable. I mean, we can't go back in time and check, right? But it's, probably just some thing that modern science can circumvent. Mostly, right? Because, I mean, it's not, we don't have a 100% surefire way of helping women with pregnancy issues. But basically, what I'm trying to do here is not have people over spiritualize this passage, where it talks about how God closed her womb, and not like, because when you over spiritualize it, I think the temptation is to view God kind of nefariously, right? That, oh, he's kind of mean, he doesn't want this woman to have kids or something. Like, that's obviously not the case, right? But rather, you read the next few passages, and it's more of that Samuel is kind of a miracle child, right? And so Samuel has a special kind of origin, right? Samuel's special, and of course, with that being said, that adds a more like, how do I put it? Because he's not normal, right? He's more than normal, and so he's got some kind of divine nature to him, right? Kind of thing. It's kind of the idea that Samuel 1 is putting here. That there's kind of this divine element to Samuel's birth, and of course, the obvious answer is that Samuel will be used for this important revelation that God is going to give, right, to Samuel, and by extension to all of us, right? That there's this important revelation that's going to be given to Samuel, and so his birth is viewed as a kind of divine moment, right? God made a way, right, for Hannah to have a kid, even though normally she would have pregnancy problems of some kind, right? So that's the way you should view that passage. And so as we move forward from here, and when the revelation does show up, right, when God gives Samuel the revelation, you're supposed to view it as like, yes, this is the moment, right? This is why you're here, Samuel, is to bring us this revelation, right? Us, the readers, obviously. And so that's something important to think about. So that's kind of the big thing about chapter 1 I really want to talk about. I just want to kind of prevent people from over spiritualizing certain passages like that, but rather treat this as a more like a woman who's having, pregnancy problems, just praying about it, right? As opposed to like, oh, like God is doing this like weird stuff. It's like, no, not at all, right? Like, in a way, God doesn't act at the beginning of the story, but then he kind of, he answers a prayer, right? As opposed to like, oh, it's his fault that Hannah can't have kids, right? That's not the case at all. All right, I think that's it for chapter 1. We have an origin story, and that Samuel is a special baby. Chapter 2, and I am not doing this in the woman's voice I gave Hannah. Then Hannah prayed and said, "My heart rejoices in the Lord. In the Lord my horn is lifted high. My mouth boasts over my enemies, for I delight in your deliverance. There is no one holy like the Lord. There is none beside you. There is no rock like our God. Do not keep talking so proudly, or let your mouth speak such arrogance. For the Lord is a God who knows, and by him deeds are weighed. The bows of the warriors are broken, but those who stumbled are armed with strength. Those who are full hire themselves out for food. But those who are hungry no more. She who was barren has borne 7 children, but she who had many sons pines away. The Lord brings death and makes alive. He brings down to the grave and rises up. The Lord sends poverty and wealth. He humbles and he exalts. He raises the poor from the dust and lifts the needy from the ash heap. He seats them with princes and has them inherit a throne of honor. For the foundations of the earth are the Lord's, and on them he has set the world. He will guard the feet of his faithful servants, but the wicked will be silenced in the place of darkness. It is not by strength that one prevails. Those who oppose the Lord will be broken. The Most High will thunder from heaven. The Lord will judge the ends of the earth. He will give strength to his king and exalt the horn of his anointed. Then Elkanah went home to Ramah. But the boy ministered before the Lord under Eli the prince. The priest, not prince. Eli the priest. Remember, not Age of Kings yet. Verse 12. Now Eli had 2 sons, and they were scoundrels. They had no regard for the Lord. So it's a little closer. I don't have to if I end up straining my voice, I hope I don't. Then I don't have to put as much effort. But anyway, let's do that again. Verse 12. Now Eli had 2 sons, and they were scoundrels. They had no regard for the Lord. Now it was the practice of the priests. Scam call. You can tell by the area code on the caller ID. Now it was the practice of the priest that whenever any of the people offered a sacrifice, the priest's servant would come with a 3-pronged fork in his hand while the meat was being boiled, and would plunge the fork into the pan or kettle or cauldron or pot. Whatever the fork brought up, the priest would take for himself. Sorry about that. I mean, why do these people call it this hour anyway? Most of us are at work. I mean, right now it's like 3:45. So, where I live, you wouldn't call people mostly at that time, but anyway. Let's try this again. Verse 13. Now it was the practice of the priests that whenever any of the people offered a sacrifice, the priest's servant would come with a 3-pronged fork in his hand while the meat was being boiled, and would plunge the fork into the pan or kettle or cauldron or pot. Whatever the fork brought up, the priest would take for himself. This is how they treated all the Israelites who came to Shiloh. But even before the fat was burned, the priest's servant would come and say to the person who was sacrificing, "Give the priest some of the meat to roast. He won't accept boiled meat from you, but only raw." If the person said to him, "Let the fat be burned first, and then take whatever you want," the servant would answer, "No, hand it over now. If you don't, I'll take it by force." This sin of the young men was very great in the Lord's sight, for they were treating the Lord's offering with contempt. But Samuel was ministering before the Lord, a boy wearing a linen ephod. And each year his mother made him a little robe and took it to him when she went out with her husband to offer the annual sacrifice. Eli would bless Elkanah and his wife, saying, "May the Lord give your children by this woman, to take the place of the one she prayed for and give to the Lord." Then they would go home. And the Lord was gracious to Hannah. She gave birth to 3 sons and 2 daughters. Meanwhile, the boy Samuel grew up in the presence of the Lord. Now Eli, who was very old, heard about everything his sons were doing to all Israel, and how they slept with the women who served at the entrance to the tent of meeting. So he said to them, "Why do you do such things? I hear from all the people about these wicked deeds of yours. No, my sons, the report I hear spreading among the Lord's people is not good. If one person sins against another, God may mediate for the offender. But if anyone sins against the Lord, who will intercede for them?" His sons, however, did not listen to their father's rebuke, for it was the Lord's will to put them to death. And the boy Samuel continued to grow in stature and in favor with the Lord and with people. Now a man of God came to Eli and said to him, "This is what the Lord says. Did I not clearly reveal myself to your ancestors' family when they were in Egypt under the Pharaoh? I chose your ancestor out of all the tribes of Israel to be my priest, to go up to my altar, to burn incense, and to wear an ephod in my presence. I also gave your ancestors' family all the food offerings presented by the Israelites. Why do you honor your sons more than me by fattening yourselves on the choice parts of every offering made by my people? Therefore, the Lord, the God of Israel, declares, I promised that members of your family would minister before me forever. But now the Lord declares, far be it from me. Those who honor me I will honor, and those who despise me will be disdained. The time is coming when I will cut short your strength and the strength of your priestly house, so that no one in it will reach old age. And you will see distress in my dwelling. Although good will be done to Israel, no one in your family will ever reach old age. Every one of you I do not cut off from serving at my altar. I will spare only to destroy your sight and sap your strength. And all your descendants will die in the prime of life. And what happens to your 2 sons, Hophni and Phinehas, will be a sign to you. They will both die on the same day. And I will raise up for myself a faithful priest, who will do according to what is in my heart and mind. And I will firmly establish his priestly house, and they will minister before my anointed one always. Then everyone left in your family will come and bow down before him for a piece of silver and a loaf of bread. Appoint me to some priestly office so I can eat." And that's chapter 2. Boy howdy, there's a lot in chapter 2 to unpack, so let's do this thing. So the first thing in chapter 2 is Hannah's prayer. And Hannah's prayer, there's these times in the Bible where, these people make prayers, and more often than not, they're women, that make these, long prayer things that are kind of the inspiration of tons of worship songs that you find in churches. But Hannah's song is a pretty straightforward one. Of course, because it's a song, it's got all the windy, windy words. But if you want a TLDR of what Hannah's prayer basically is, and once again, this is where, as I mentioned in chapter 1, it would be wrong to over-spiritualize, certain, passages like God closing a woman's womb kind of thing, right? Closing Hannah's womb in chapter 1. It would be wrong to over-spiritualize those things. And the TLDR of Hannah's prayer in chapter 2 kind of sums that up pretty well, right? Is, we are thankful for what God does, is what she's saying, right? I give thanks for what he does. Because the fact of the matter is, since God is the end all be all, he doesn't have to do anything, right? But thankful to him who answers my prayer is what the TLDR of this song is, right? And that's why there's this weird back and forth, God brings to the grave, he raises up. He sends poverty and wealth. He humbles and he exalts. He raises the poor and he lifts the needy, and he also seats with princes, right? And so this idea that you know, life is life, right? And stuff in life is not so great, and some of the stuff in life is great. But at the end of the day, God is the end all be all, and it is His will that matters. And when He answers our prayer, it is the most highest privilege, right? And of course, Hannah is saying this as a response to Samuel being born, of course, right? And we got to think about Hannah's context, right? That as a woman that's struggled to have kids for who knows how long, right? And she finally has her son Samuel, right? And of course, she is nothing short of absolutely ecstatic about it, right? And so, this prayer is that even though you don't have to do anything, God, you're the end all be all. So who cares what the rest of us, what us mortals do, right? But despite that, God, you hear us and you answer our prayer, and that's a very powerful thing to remember, right? That yeah, it's very easy to feel so insignificant in life. I mean, in the grand scheme of things, we kind of are, but God answers your prayers. God hears you, right? And then, of course, to crank up more of the Christian message, if you will, is that well, God desires a relationship with you, really, right? Like, who are we, right? That God wants to be our friend, right? Who are we really, right? Bunch of little nobodies, right? But God still does, and that is the highest privilege, right? And so this is what Hannah's song basically kind of the TLDR is, you know, even though God, you're the master of the universe, everything starts and ends with you, right? You answer my prayer. Like, wow. How can I be thankful enough? Right? And that's something we should always remember. I was in my Bible devotional this morning. There was the writer of the devotional. He was referencing Albert Einstein. And Albert Einstein had a pretty interesting observation about life, kind of his philosophy, if you will. And Albert Einstein said, there are only two ways you could look at life. Either none of life is a miracle, or all of life is a miracle, right? And so the idea was that either there's no reason for anything, or everything is designed for a purpose, and everything has its reason to be, right? And so the point of this was, well, the devotional guy was talking about was that yeah, it is true that there's really only two ways to look at it, right? And the Bible is very clear. You can either look at it as everything being kind of gloomy, or you can look at all the blessings in life, right? And so we go back to Hannah's song, and even though both of them exist, the crappy and the good, what makes God good is that He responds to us in the midst of all that, right? He answers our prayer in the midst of that, even though He really has no obligation to, right? Because once again, God allows the crappy things to happen, and He also allows the good things to happen in life, right? And God can simply sit back, right? And a lot of people use the clockmaker metaphor, the watchmaker metaphor about God, and there's some truth to that, right? Because in a way, God has no obligation. He doesn't. He just make the universe and then be done. All right, done. Job well done. It was good, and just go on with whatever He wants to do, right? I mean, who's God? I'm not going to tell Him what to do, right? But that's certainly one way God could have done things, right? But He doesn't. And we read in Hannah's song, it's a reminder of that. Like, God doesn't simply just, kick back after He's done His watchmaking, using the watchmaker metaphor. But instead, God is very conscious about our needs and our prayers, and that is a most wonderful thing to have, right? Hannah is praising in the song, that virtue about God. It's a weird way to look at it, but basically that's what Hannah's praising, right? And of course, once again, this is all in gratitude to the birth of Samuel. Excuse me, to the birth of Samuel. So that's the first part. The second part I want to talk about, it goes from verse 12 to verse 26. Well, actually, no, before that. Verse 12 to verse, well, no, it does go all the way down to 26. But once again, this part is kind of divided into two parts, right? So now we got to talk about the priest Eli and his really crappy sons, right? And he's got two sons that are just absolutely awful. And from verse 12 to verse 26, there are two major crimes that they do. And the funny thing about reading this, we read this, and this is like 10th century BC or whatever. But you can easily see the same kind of problem in 2021, right? And so the first thing is that these priests, Hophni and Phineas, are they're crooks, right? And they're basically thieves, right? In God's house, right? And they're serving as priests, right? We have thieves for priests, right? Real great. And so the story starts with, there's a custom that the Israelites had in their sacrifice system, right? You kill the animal and then you give the leftovers to the priest to provide for them, right? Because I mentioned this in the book of Exodus read through and a little bit in the book of Judges read through that we did, in how after the Israelites come into the land of Canaan and they take it over, and then the land's kind of divided between the 12 tribes. But remember, there's 13 of them because Joseph technically has two tribes, the Ephraim and Manasseh. And then one of the tribes doesn't actually get a land inheritance, and that's the tribe of Levi. And basically, what's supposed to happen, is that while the other 12 get to live in their little land settlements, the tribe of Levi was supposed to split up and act as priests for all the other tribes, right? And so, because they were not given a land inheritance, basically the rest of the Israelites were commanded to provide for the Levites. And part of that was how there's a temple tax, even though this was before the temple was built, but you get the idea. There's like the temple tax, right? When you do your religious ceremonies, you pay the priests, right? You got your temple tax, when you do offerings, right? And your burnt offerings, then the leftover meat gets given to the priest to provide for them, right? Kind of like a compensation, right? Because the priest has to be the one to perform the sacrifice ritual and all that stuff, right? That kind of thing. And so you kind of give them the meat to provide for them, right? As a compensation. And, this is not a simply Judeo-Christian idea, right? This is an idea that has existed in other cultures. It's kind of like a logical thing too, right? Like to treat priests as if it was a job, right? And so you have to pay them, and giving them some of the food was part of the payment. But at the same time, the sacrifice also had other implications, right? That it was a reminder for people not to be so self-centered, right? And that's why you sacrifice to God, and people think, well, that's kind of a waste, right? Giving something to God who doesn't need any of this stuff, right? That's kind of seems like a waste, but it was a reminder for people not to be so self-centered. So the irony here is the people that would be compensated for the reminder of people's selflessness, if you will. The people that are supposed to carry the ordinances, these priests, these guys end up being the selfish ones, right? Which clearly a big no-no, right? And so that's the first crime, right? And so how the crime kind of spell it out. So what's going on here, right? So basically, what the people who were sacrificing would do is they would throw this, this animal basically, into a big pot, whatever, right? And then they would boil it like a lot, and the they would boil it to the point that the fat would get boiled up. And so those of you that cook may know that when you're boiling fat, fat will rise up pretty quickly, right? And then it'll get separated from the rest of the meat because it rises up to the top of the water, right? And so what they were supposed to do was wait for that to happen. The fat would rise up, and then the priest's servant would come up with a fork, and he would stab into the thing and then pull out the rest of the animal, right? Whatever was left. Of course, there are several problems with this from a cooking standpoint, right? Is that usually when you boil meat for that long, it tends to be not that great because it's always overcooked, right? You always get overcooked meat when you're boiling it to the point that the fat separates, right, from the rest of the meat. You've overdone it. And so, I mean, you could try and justify these guys' behavior because, like, look, sure, the priests get free food, but, like, a lot of it is not very good, right? Or it's not good compared to, like, food with the fat in it, right? Which then brings up the next point about why the fat, right? And why the fat needs to be burned off and sacrificed to the Lord. Well, once again, it goes back to the whole, like, not being selfish, and more importantly, you give God your best. And so there are implications in other parts of the Levitical law. I don't remember the verses off the top of my head, but there are parts where, like, you sacrifice, the choice parts of the animal to God to give him the first fruit of your your labors, right? You give God the best is basically the idea. And so, whether we're in 10th century BC or 21st century AD, we know the fat is the best part of the animal. Let's be real. The fat is amazing, right? I mean, as a Chinese guy who loves duck, duck fat is nothing short of, like, the nectar of the gods, right? So, anyway, now I'm getting hungry thinking about it. But, like, basically, the fat was the best part, and so during sacrifices, you give the best part to God, which is why the fat was burned off. Now, you could try and justify the Hophni and Phineas, where, like, because they're part of the priestly order, they wouldn't get the chance to eat the fat normally, right? Because temple tax doesn't pay enough, maybe. And two, you might think, well, why waste the best part, right? But of course, once again, this is the idea that God is trying to remove from people's thinking is you don't think about yourself first, right? Don't always put yourself first. There's times to put yourself first, but that's not one of them. And so, these guys did not care about that. They cared about themselves more than about, God and about others, right? And so that was why, as the Bible would say it, that they looked at the Lord's sacrifice with contempt, right? That they didn't care about why this mattered and the fact of doing it because God wanted to teach them to be better people. They didn't care about that. And if you're gonna have that attitude toward God, no doubt that's gonna piss him off, right? And so that was the first crime, is that they would steal the fat. And of course, there's this thing in the story, and it's easy to kind of say, like, oh, see, this is why authority figures are so bad, right? Because the regular people seem to be okay with sacrificing the fat, but there's another little contextual thing people forget, is that the average Israelite is allowed to eat fat normally on the animal. So let's say choice steak or whatever, right? You can't get choice steak from boiling the fat off the animal first, right? I would love to see a steak cooked that way and actually be good. I would love to see it, but I have never seen or cooked a steak where I boiled the fat out first. Heck no, right? Fat's the best part. So guess that. juicy feeling. You could tell. I think about these kind of things a lot. I mean, who doesn't love good food? But the average Israelite would not have worried about that much. So as we read through here in chapter 2, it's easy to just look at the authority figures as bad guys. But I mean, sure, you can make the argument that like maybe it's a flaw within the sacrifice system. I mean, you could make that argument. But once again, it's not like someone could just bring a steak dinner to a Levite on his off day, right? There would be no problem with that, right? It's not like you're not allowed to have fat any other day, right? It's just the sacrifice. You burn the fat to remind yourself that God gets your best, right? That is the reason why they do it. No other reason, really. But these guys, Hophni and Phinehas, didn't care about that, right? They just always wanted the best part. They only thought about themselves, and God was not happy about that. I mean, that makes sense, you know. Think about human relationships. We all hate people who only think about themselves, right? We have words for people like that, which I won't use because I don't want to get in trouble, right? But we have very strong words we use for people like that, right? That think about themselves all the time. And so we look at guys like Hophni and Phinehas, and they're these kind of guys, right? So obviously not good guys. Then we get to the second crime that these two guys do. Well, not just them, obviously, but these two guys in particular. Not good guys. And I'm going to skip that other part about Samuel's parents because it's kind of not relevant anymore. They kind of leave the story at this point. But from verse 22 to verse 25, we hear the next thing about Hophni and Phinehas. And how these guys are even worse than just crooks, right? It was bad enough that they defiled, you know, God's command about how to treat the sacrifice with respect, right? But of course, you know, the 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 Christian mantra, right? Love God, love your neighbor, right? I mean, that's the great commandment in a nutshell, right? And so these guys violate both because these guys are just, you know, that bad, right? So we had the whole stealing from God with the sacrifice, but then you read in verse 22 to 25, and now these guys violate people. And quite literally, in the case of, you know, taking advantage of the temple, the girls at the temple doors. So now these guys are basically just like seducing all the young girls, right? You know, these guys were probably married. Actually, these guys are married, at least by a later point of the story, because like both of them have like wives, and one of them has like a son later, and whatever. But these guys are married, and they're, you know, sleeping around with like these young girls, right? And I hate to do this because it's, you know, you hear we've all heard the stories. You know, it's not like it's an uncommon scandal, unfortunately, right? But you know the story about like, you know, that pastor, you know, ex-pastor, you know, that's like having sex with a girl in the youth group, right? Which is basically the equivalent of what these guys were doing, right? These guys were like, you know, that one associate pastor having sex with girls from the youth group, right? Like that's just wrong on so many levels, right? And yet these guys are doing that, and you know, Eli, the priest at the time of Shiloh, he's informed that his sons are doing this, right? And you know, what he should do is like kick them out, right? Because you know, you shouldn't be doing that. That's just plain evil, right? And you know, as we rightly do so today, when we catch, you know, pastors doing that kind of stuff, we kick them out and excommunicate them, basically, um, because it's a heinous crime, right? And so, you know, this kind of thing was happening, and we reached the other problem, which is something that's also very relevant today, and that's that Eli does nothing about it, right? he does nothing about his sons stealing from the sacrifice and seducing all the teenage girls, right? And Eli does nothing. And this man of God character shows up later, starting from verse 27. This man of God, not named, he shows up and he's just like, yo, man, what the actual crap, right? Why aren't you doing anything? If you don't do anything, then God will kill your family. God is going to crush your family because he's not going to put up with this. And rightly so, right? Because, I mean, think about it from a logical perspective, and you think about, like, when scandals like this happen in, like, 2021, whether it's people stealing the church money, because there are people that do that, and then, of course, people, religious leaders taking advantage of teenage girls, right? Like, not okay, right? Funny story, actually. Funny in hindsight, but I probably have, like, a target on my back that somebody might want to shove a knife into. But um, I'm I am prepared. The kala awaits me. You know, I am prepared to face my debts. I am prepared to face my destiny. But you will not find me easy prey if you're watching this. Anyway, like you would. But anyway, there's this guy I knew. You kind of see where this is going already. When I was at this one church, I this was before I started doing. This was like when I was early doing my master's. So when was this, like 7 years ago? Oh my gosh, I'm old. Like almost like 10 years ago. Well, let's see. Like I started in like 2012. It's 2021 now. So like that's 9 years ago. That's a long time ago. I'm a fossil at this point. But anyway, so when I was early in my seminary years, probably when like I think it was the year or the year after I started, and um, because when I was in seminary, I was living at the seminary, so I was living outside of the city I lived in, and that included not being at the church I had been going to for years. Um, for years. Now there was a guy that I'd become friends with before. Okay, let's backtrack. Before I went to seminary, right? And we got a new pastor at the church, and he was pretty. Him and we were friends, right? Because I was I was the guy that a new pastor should get to know at the church. Like every time we had like a new pastor, a new youth pastor, a new worship pastor, whatever. Like I was the guy to know. Because one, I was young and hip with it, and at the time, and two, I was the guy. I had been at the church for years before that, right? Because this one church, I was I started going there when I was like 12 or something, and so I had grown. I had spent my high school years there, and then like my college years there, right before I went to seminary. So that would be like another 10 years, right? Well, I'm really dating myself now. The fact that I can recall things that are like decades ago, right? But anyway, so I got to know this pastor and this associate pastor at the time. I won't name him just for the sake of integrity of the story. But anyway, um, him and I, we became friends for a while, and I was like, okay, I'm gonna go to seminary now, whatever. And I didn't go to the church for a while. And when I had come back to the church on like a holiday or something, it was like summer, it was like a spring break or something. Yeah, spring break or something. Probably my second year. Maybe it was my first year. I can't remember. This is a long time ago, guys. Like, forgive me here. But anyway, so I was visiting the church, and I was informed because one of the youth, and he wasn't. He was like 14 at the time or something, but he had always known me, right? Because I knew him when he was like a baby, right? And so anyway, he came to me, and he told me about something, and he told me that he didn't know what to do because he had learned that his sister, one of the girls in the youth group, she was constantly like harassed by this guy, by the pastor, and he would do inappropriate things. He would touch her and stuff like that, and um, always like sext her, you know, sex messaging, sexting. See, I'm so young and hip with it, I swear. Anyway, so he was like, sending like inappropriate, he was acting very inappropriate way and sexting her and stuff like this. And I guess one thing that, if you get to know me as the kind of person that I am, I'm a very speak with my actions kind of guy, right? And uh, in a funny, ironic way, I guess I'm more like Christian extremist than I like to admit. But I was the guy who reacted very strongly to this, and um, I was, when I heard about these accusations, I was like, well, let me talk to your sister, and we talked, and she told me about everything, and I was like, why haven't you told anyone else, right? Why didn't you tell anyone else in the church? Why didn't you tell the senior pastor or whatever, right? And she was just so afraid, right? Because of course teenage girls are, I mean, what can they do? They can't do anything. But what, she didn't know what to do. And of course the other thing too was that this guy was popular, right? He became well liked in the church too. And so but it's one of those things where it's like, no, you do what's right because it's right. That was kind of the conviction that God had given me at that moment. You do what's right because it's right. And so I confronted him in church, right? I confronted him. I was like, I heard you've been doing these, things with this girl in your youth group. He wasn't the youth pastor. He was the associate pastor, but he was like, in the youth group. You're doing these things with this girl in the youth group. Like, no, this is not okay, right? And I'm going to, and I'm exposing you now, right? Because I'm getting you kicked out because you can't be here. You can't be calling yourself a man of God and doing stuff like this. And I confronted him, and you know, he tried to play it off cool, call me crazy, as it tends to be when you're accusing someone of something like that. And then I had the girl, like, I told her to be brave. It's like, you have to tell everyone here, right? We're doing this, and I know it's hard for you, but we're doing this, right? And when I had her confess to in front of the church that this was going on, that he was doing this to her, and everybody in their everyone in their shock of disbelief, it's like, well, what do we do? It's like, well, we kick him the hell out, right? And so, yeah, I kicked out a pastor out of a church, and that was probably why I became unpopular and have not got a real church position since. Um, nobody likes no one likes a snitch, right? So, I mean, I thought we weren't in a prison, but I guess this applies to churches too, where snitches are the bottom of the bottom, and I am a snitch. So, if you want the joke about prisons, for those of you who don't get it, so the idea is that if you're a snitch in the criminal world, you are the most garbage human being, right? Because you can have like murderers, rapists, snitches, right? Like snitches are at the bottom, and so maybe that's the real reason why I can't get a real pastoral job, right? Um, but if I were to do those moments again, I would do it the same, right? You do what's right because it's right. That's what it means to honor God and to love your neighbor, right? That's what it means to obey God's commandments. At least that's how I've always believed it to be. But hey, I'm just some streaming Parson, so what do I know? But you see here in Samuel 2. Sorry for the long tangent, but I might as well tell the story because it's a good one. And why probably people hate me now. But hey, it is better to be hated by men and recognized and loved by God than to be loved by men and hated by God. Just like these guys, right? Like, you know, uh, Phineas and Hophni. You know, God hated these guys, and God meant like God was pretty mean, right? And we read this part in the end of Second Samuel, or sorry, wow, the end of Samuel, First Samuel chapter 2. We read at the end here that like God, this prophet prophesies, this man of God prophesies to Eli like God is going to treat you very, very badly because your sons have done this. And on top of that, you, Eli, have done nothing, right? Of course, Eli kind of puts excuses like, well, I tried, but my sons wouldn't listen to me. It's like, no, you kick him the hell out, right? Like, you excommunicate him. Should have been the response of the man of God, but we don't hear that. But I assume that's what he said. If I were this guy, that's definitely what I would have said. So, with that said, though, the main thing that's going on in chapter 2 is there's this interesting contrast. Now that we've gone through the bit by bit, but kind of the general thing that's going on here is that there's going to be a contrast between the false religious leaders and the real people of God. And there's a split between them. And it's represented in, Samuel will be the real person of God, if you will. And then, of course, the false religious leaders with Hophni and Phineas. And so, once again, you have to take some author bias in this scenario here too, right? Because of course Samuel's probably going to look even better than he actually is, but he's still a good guy if you have to compare him to these guys, right? Like, I mean, Samuel may be a brutal person, but he's not a scumbag like these guys, right? Like, but there's still that. But of course, the thing that makes Samuel, an important, as influential as he will become, is that he will be a real man of God, right? He'll be a real person that obeys God's commands, even when it's rough at times, right? And so Samuel is viewed as like this character of virtue, and of course he is contrasted to Eli's sons, official priest, but they're garbage human beings, right? Because you know God wants obedience, right? And he wants love, right? He does not want simply position, right? Your position means nothing, right? It is who you are. And so Samuel is going to be set up as this like really good guy. And there's even this little throwaway passage in verse 26, right? And Samuel grew up and he continued to grow in stature and in favor with the Lord and with people, right? So Samuel grew favor with God and with people. And that's a pretty important thing to point out because, when he becomes the next prophet, spoiler, um, you know, when Samuel has that favor with God, then he will be a powerful, effective person, right? And he won't be someone who taints the legacy. And because he doesn't taint the legacy, if you will, of being God's priest, then when he receives the revelation from God, when we get there, it holds, right? And it holds weight. And because it holds weight, you better pay attention to it, right? We better pay attention to the revelation that God will give Samuel, because Samuel will already establish himself as being like, no, this prophecy is legit because I have favor with God and God has revealed it to me. It's kind of what Samuel will end up doing, but we'll get there when we get there. But the interesting thing about chapter 2 is just this interesting contrast between Samuel and the other priest. On a weird throwaway note, I might as well throw away. I have dealt with a number of scumbaggy, quote-unquote, pastors. I even punched a few of them because, I guess you could argue I'm a bit of a scumbag myself, but not in that way, though, right? I may get a little violent at times though. That would probably be my vice. But there are some guys that I still think deserve had it coming to them. As far as that guy, that I publicly embarrassed and had him kicked out of the church, I hear he I don't know what he does now, but my brother told me that like, oh yeah, I like see his Facebook pictures and he's like all ripped and stuff now. I'm like, well, crap. He's probably prepping up for a rematch. I'll be ready. I'm prepared to face my destiny. Anyway, so that's it for chapter 2. I'm gonna read chapter 3. That should take us to about 5 o'clock, and we'll see how we are from there. But chapter 3 has so much in it. I feel like I could read chapter 3 and then end the stream because like chapter 3 has so much good content. So let's dive right into it after I take this drink. Why carbonated drinks are not the best thing to drink on stream, especially when you're reading. Which I should know this, being a pastor. But I like carbonated drinks too much, and I keep doing it. But anyway, chapter 3. So the boy Samuel ministered before the Lord under Eli. And in those days the word of the Lord was rare. There were not many visions. Now one night, Eli, whose eyes were becoming so weak that he could barely see, was lying down in his usual place. The lamp of God had not yet gone out, and Samuel was lying down in the house of the Lord, where the ark of God was. And then the Lord called to Samuel. And Samuel answered, Here I am. And he ran to Eli and said, Here I am. You called me? But Eli said, I did not call. Go back and lie down. So Samuel went and lay down. And the Lord called Samuel. Samuel. And Samuel got up and went to Eli and said, Here I am. You called me? My son, Eli said, I did not call. Go back and lie down. Now Samuel did not yet know the Lord, and the word of the Lord had not been revealed to him. So a third time the Lord called Samuel. Samuel. And Samuel got up, went to Eli and said, Here I am. You called me? At that time, Eli realized that the Lord was calling the boy. So Eli told Samuel, Go and lie down, and if he calls you, say, Speak, Lord, for your servant is listening. So Samuel went and lay down in his place. The Lord came and stood there, calling at all the other times, Samuel, Samuel. Then Samuel said, Speak, for your servant is listening. And the Lord said to Samuel, See, I am about to do something in Israel that will make the ears of everyone who hears about it tingle. At that time I will carry out against Eli everything I spoke about his family, from beginning to end. For I told him that I would judge his family forever because of the sin he knew about, his sons blaspheming me. And he failed to restrain them. Therefore I swore to the house of Eli, the guilt of Eli's house will never be atoned for by sacrifice, or offering. Now Samuel lay down until morning, and then opened the doors of the house of the Lord. Samuel was afraid to tell Eli the vision, but Eli called to him and said, "Samuel, my son." "Here I am." "What was it that he said to you?" "Do not hide it from me. May God deal with you, be it ever so severely." Excuse me. "If you hide from me anything he told you." So Samuel told him everything, hiding nothing from him. Then Eli said, "He is the Lord. Let him do what is good in his eyes." The Lord was with Samuel as he grew up, and he let none of Samuel's words fall to the ground. And all of Israel, from Dan to Beersheba, recognized that Samuel was attested as a prophet of the Lord. The Lord continued to appear at Shiloh, and there he revealed himself to Samuel through his word. And Samuel's word came to all Israel. And that's chapter 3. And boy howdy, there's a lot in chapter 3, right? It's the... If anyone knows the story of the prophet Samuel, which I know he's not as popular as other prophets in the Bible, but this is like, you know, the well-known part of his story, right? And so Samuel is called by God. And so, you know, it's kind of, there's a lot of more that older mythology stuff that happens, as we were talking about, like the book of in Exodus is a great example. Genesis, obviously, but Exodus more, where like God kind of like just appears, and he's kind of like, the Bible kind of treats it as if like, yeah, it's just something that happens, right? And so, you know, God like just enters his place, right? And he calls to Samuel, right? I know I gave God like the ghost voice because it was kind of fun to do it, but you know, he's kind of calling out to Samuel, and Samuel doesn't know, right? And of course he doesn't yet. He's still young and hasn't had his, you know, his encounter with God yet, right? Because, I mean, to be fair, it doesn't just happen when you want it to. It's when God decides it happens, right? So, um, you know, Samuel encounters God for the first time. And of course, the Bible does this little funny thing where, like, you know, Samuel goes back and forth between where he's sleeping and to Eli, right? To Eli's room. And he goes back and forth, right? Because, you know, Samuel's just this little confused kid, and it's kind of this little funny scene, right? He goes back and forth. He's like, "I'm here. You know, you called me. Did you call?" Right? And Eli's just like, "What are you talking about? Like, go away. Go back to sleep," right? And so, you know, but something that's interesting is that, like, even though Eli has accepted that, like, yeah, because of my incompetence and my son's evil, I'm basically, like, totally screwed. But at the same time, it's interesting in this scene where Eli still recognizes, you know, God's voice, right? That Eli still recognizes it to an extent where he recognizes that it's God who's calling Samuel. And so, you know, Eli gives him the instruction, Samuel, the instruction to, like, you know, tell God, you know, it's the Lord, and tell him that you're listening. And then, of course, you know, the Bible does this funny thing where, like, how would you imagine this happening, right? Like, well, I mean, we wouldn't really, outside of the person of Jesus Christ, we wouldn't know how to imagine what God looked like. But, you know, God shows up, right? And he's just standing there over, like, Samuel's lying body, just like, hey, you, right? I'm talking to you. And it's just kind of one of those funny, I don't know, I find these kind of things funny, right? And, you know, God's just standing there. And he's just like, hey, you. So, I'm going to do this thing. I'm not going to tell you what it is yet, but I'll tell you the first thing I'm going to do. And I'm going to basically, like, punish Eli's family and pave a way for you. Based the implication is that God is paving a way for Samuel, right? And of course, this is important to think about, that God is paving Samuel's path ahead of him, right? Once again, there's this kind of miracle child moment, right? And these kind of divine elements, for lack of better words, that are being given to Samuel, right? You can think the exact same thing with like Joseph, right? Back in Genesis, that Joseph. Understandable, you can get confused, but there's a lot of them. So with Joseph in Genesis, there was a lot of everything was like God had basically like lined up his ducks in a row, if you will, before he used Joseph for what he was going to do, right? The saving of a people, right? The saving of the people of Israel and Egypt, right? And so God kind of lined up all his ducks in a row and then just went for it, right? The same thing is kind of happening here with Samuel. And there you can draw this parallel between like Samuel and Joseph, right? Joseph is a miracle child because Rachel couldn't have kids for who knows how long. And then, Hannah is also like that, right? Hannah couldn't have kids for who knows how long. I mean, that's why Elkanah had a second wife, right? So he could have an heir, right? And so that implies that Hannah had, if assuming Hannah is the first wife, which I can assume is the case, Bible doesn't really tell us, but it's safe to assume that Hannah was the first wife, and the reason why he got the second wife was because Hannah, for a while, like some longer period of time, let's say 10 years, right? So let's hypothetically say that like Elkanah married Hannah when she was 16, and he might have been like in his 20s or early 30s, right? And then 10 years happen, so she's 26, still no kids, right? And they're like, all right, fine, we'll let Elkanah have another wife, and as he approaches his 40, right? Because he has no kids at the age of 40, right? Let's we're just mental experimenting here, uh, hypothesizing what could have happened is what I'm doing. And then he had a whole bunch of kids with Penina, that was her name, yeah. And then similar to the Rachel story, Hannah in her older age, well, not as old as Rachel, but in her older age, finally has Samuel, right? And so there's that parallel there, right? That they're miracle children there, and of course, certain things had to happen, certain bad things had to happen for them to be used greatly by God. Now, with Samuel, we haven't gotten there yet because we're only in chapter 3, and Samuel's going to do some stuff later. But with Joseph, we saw that, like, he got sold to slavery. He was falsely accused and thrown in prison for like 7 years or whatever it was, right? And so Joseph went through some bad stuff, but then of course that made the grand opportunity came where Joseph interprets Pharaoh's dream, and so the prophetic moment comes up, right? Now with Samuel, we're not going to get there. We haven't gotten there yet, but you can see that God is doing the same kind of thing. So miracle baby with Samuel, then the bad things are going to happen, right? So we have Hophni and Phineas, right? They're the bad guys. They're doing bad things, and God is saying like, well, I'm going to deal with this first before I use you. Just like with the Joseph story, he had to have Jacob's other sons be broken down as men before they can accept going to Egypt. So that's why it took so long for God to put Joseph in his position of power. In the same way, in the book of Samuel, in this case, it's quite literal. It's like extreme here, where God's like, I'm not just gonna break these guys out. I'm gonna kill them, right? And that will pave way for you to do great things. And of course, as I made the parallel with the Joseph story, there's going to be the prophetic part. But with Samuel, we'll see that, we'll get there. But of course, at the end of chapter 3, Nathan I'm going to refer to the writer as Nathan now. It's going to be a kind of a force of habit. That's kind of always. That's how I've always read this book. Nathan is going to kind of talk about, like, he kind of paves it, right? Like, yes, he is established as a prophet of Israel. The way is paved. What is God going to say now, right? What is God going to have his prophets say now, right? What is that prophetic moment going to be, right? And is it going to be as life-saving as when Joseph did it, right? When Joseph saved Egypt, right? And so that's kind of the idea that's given when we read through chapter 3, right? That now the way is paved. And it's funny that, like, Eli's just like, yeah, I accept the crappy fate I'm gonna have. Sucks, but I guess this is how it is, right? I didn't stop my sons from doing evil. They keep doing evil until the day they die, um, which is gonna be pretty soon, by the way. If you read ahead in the Bible, it's like the next chapter, basically. So yeah, they're gonna die, because God's like, I've had it with these guys. I'm gonna do something new in Israel, right? I'm gonna use Samuel to bring revelation to the people. But they got to get rid of these guys first, right? The Eli's sons, the bad priests, right? And so this is the setup, right? The first 3 chapters, we kind of read up the setup chapters, right? And then next week we'll cover you know, some rough things are going to happen. In Christianese we call it the refiner's fire, right? Because of course the Bible uses a lot of like pottery imagery when it talks about like forming a nation. It uses a lot of pottery metaphors, and the Bible's notorious for doing that. There's a lot of them. And so, you know, there's going to be a refiner's fire process where, like, yeah, we got to burn out all the bad things, the impurities, right? In this case, Hophni and Phinehas. So God is prepping up for that. And of course, by doing so, is paving that way for Samuel, right? And of course, because Samuel has all the ducks lined up for him, right? This is used so that when Samuel is given the revelation, which we'll get to when we get there, when he gets the revelation, that's something to like look out, right? Because this is serious. This is, God means business when he gives this revelation to Samuel. And so that will be we'll start going through the refiner's fire part, dealing with Phinehas and Hophni and other things not so good in Israel. We'll cover that next week, right? Because I think this is a good place to stop, because chapter 3 is like the setup, right? And so we have done the setup for what the book of Samuel is going to be about, right? The way is paved, and so we'll get to the major themes soon enough. But with that being said, this is going to be the end of the reading. If you have questions and stuff like that, you can post them in the chat and I'll get to it. But before I end the stream, I'm just going to do some housekeeping. So the first thing is, I've started some new projects, if you will, like for the last couple weeks for Throwback Thursdays, which is kind of like the video scheduling, right? So Monday and Wednesdays, I'll be streaming StarCraft 2, which I just started this week. So definitely check that out. They are at 2 o'clock Pacific time, 2 o'clock p.m., obviously, Pacific time. And those are on Mondays and Wednesdays. And so that's going to be the next thing I'm going to do for a while, because I have a feeling StarCraft is going to take me a while to beat. Because I plan to actually play the whole trilogy of StarCraft 2. Of course, that means I got to go buy the other 2 parts. But, we'll cross that bridge when we get there, right? So I'll be playing StarCraft 2 on Mondays and Wednesdays from 2 o'clock to 6 o'clock. which is normally what I do. And of course, on Thursdays, I have a Throwback Thursday upload series. I'm playing through an old classic favorite of mine called Heroes of Might and Magic 2. So definitely check that one out. That's Throwback Thursdays, so the uploads show up on Thursdays. And of course, Friday we have our regular reading streams, and they are at 3 o'clock. So with that being said, if there's no questions or anything like that, this is going to be the end of the stream. Hope you guys learned something. I hope you guys enjoyed, starting the Book of Samuel. I know we're not in the more interesting parts yet, but trust me, we'll get there. Some good stuff coming up because it's the Book of Samuel, and honestly, one that I always enjoy reading because I'm, I guess, a crazy person like that. It's like, shouldn't there be other books that are more interesting to read than Samuel? I was like, nah, man, Samuel's got like so many epic moments. But anyway, I'll be continuing the Book of Samuel next week at 3 o'clock Pacific time. Try not to be as late. And I'll try not to be as tired today so I can actually go a little longer. But I mean, once again, the length of a stream also depends on like what chapters I'm reading. Because like some parts you don't want to like... You want to do like an story arc at a time. And if there's like a short one and then a really long one, you don't want to like do the long one halfway. You know what I mean, right? But anyway, next week we'll continue with the Book of Samuel, and we'll see if I can do a longer stream. I know this one's not as long as I normally do, but that's alright. With that being said, you guys have a great rest of your day. Hope you guys have a great weekend. And I will try to have this lighting thing fixed by the time I stream next, which is on Monday. So, hope to see you guys then. You guys have a great weekend. And God bless you.